to your colleagues as it is of interest. Okay, so for the sake of time, I am going to hand it over to Carrie with the Nature Conservancy, and she will introduce our speaker.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Carrie Koska. I'm with the Idaho chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and I also serve on the governing board for the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership. So thanks all for taking the time today. As Elizabeth mentioned too, this is kind of a new thing we're trying. Hopefully this works out well and is something we hope to offer some future programming as well. Some of the topics might include furthering some discussion on support networks for collaboratives, kind of building off what we talked about last month at the IFRP annual conference, the abbreviated version, and then also trying to bring some citizen science presentations to the group and some of the work that's being done there. So excited about hopefully making some of this available, and we're particularly excited for this presentation today and having Greg with us. I was able to see a similar presentation to the Idaho legislature earlier this year at Forestry Day at the legislature, and it was great content, great discussion, just really good information, really timely information. So excited to have Greg here today to be bringing this. And again, as Elizabeth mentioned, it's being recorded, it's going to be available for folks online, and please do share so everyone is able to access. I will attempt to moderate with questions, so shoot them either directly to me in the chat or to the group, and we'll make sure to get those thrown out at the end and hopefully have some time for some good discussion. And then otherwise, if you have any other questions, Elizabeth or myself are available if you want to just shoot them to us during the chat, and look forward to some good conversation. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn over to Greg. Greg Latta is a research assistant professor of forest economics at the University of Idaho, and he's also the interim director of the policy analysis group also at the University of Idaho. So working very closely with our other colleague, Dr. Becker, and Greg's work focuses on simulating policy impacts on markets using mathematical optimization techniques. So maybe he can talk some more about that, because I will not even venture to guess. But he has extensive experience in modeling and the nexus of agricultural, forest, and energy markets. So again, it's just really relevant, really good, useful information for us, and especially with all that's happening in the world today, kind of understanding some of the changing dynamics of the markets and related to Idaho forests in particular. So again, super excited to have Greg here with us, and I'll go ahead and turn the time over and he'll be sharing his presentation. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Greg, especially for making this possible today.
All right, you're welcome. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Let's go to share screen here. And do a slideshow. And all right, so let's see, thumbs up, Carrie, if you can see the screen now. Okay, so my name is Greg Latta. I'm the interim director of the policy analysis group here at the University of Idaho. And so Carrie's right, this is a talk I gave at Forestry Day at the legislature. Dennis, or Dean Becker, whatever you want to call him, asked me to come in and do kind of a background on economics and a little bit of a focus on federal forests and how they fit in with economics. So policy analysis group, we are a group of people here at the University of Idaho. It's a changing group, students and researchers that we have that look at natural resource policy for the legislature. So it's kind of a unique situation we have here in having this direct university-related group that talks to the legislature. I'm going to go over first forests and what we do, and then I'm going to go into a little bit of how we fit in nationwide, then a policy thing, take you back to school for a little Econ 101, and then tell you things that scare me or keep me awake at night that aren't coronavirus type things going on. So Idaho has 53 million acres. National Forest System lands comprise 12 million acres of that. State's got 1.1 million acres. And there's 2.8 million acres of timberland out there, or private timberland. So you can look at that pie chart there at the right. We got a lot of forests. We have a lot of federal forests in Idaho. We've done these county level workbooks. This is out on our website. I'm going to pitch a couple products here in the beginning. You can go out there for every county. You can see what the acres of forests are, who owns those forests, what the jobs are, and what the milling looks like. Each page has one of these. We designed them to be handed out, say at county fairs and that sort of thing, where you have natural resource programs. We also track the industry. And so this is one of our reports that we've condensed down, or two that we've condensed into one. There's one side that focuses on timber harvest by owner, and the production of lumber and plywood. And the other side of the page looks at economic contributions, the direct and indirect jobs associated with that, the GDP and the labor income that goes to the state. So big thing here is that there is $2.2 billion of contribution to Idaho's gross state product from the forest sector. And there are 24 jobs created per 1,000 or million board feet within the state. 13 direct jobs and 13 support jobs. So we have a table that kind of lays it out: forest management, operations, and production. So if you want that, we're going to update it every other year, or we're going to try every year. We'll see if we do it that going forward. So you'll have this data set moving forward. What we also do, though, is we track this little guy getting in the way here. We track forests products as they move through. So, right, we look from harvest over on the left, what types of things are harvested off which types of land. So these are logs. They're delivered as we move right into sawmills. We get residues that come out of there that join with the pulpwood. We do have one chemical pulp plant in Oregon. We also transmit a lot of logs out of state to other pulp mills up in the Spokane region. They produce paper products that goes along with the lumber out to private or the demand, or out of state and other uses. So we're kind of, it's this cascading wood use that we have that we're tracking here. And that cascading wood use, we also have cascading jobs. So this is a little about those direct and indirect or support jobs that we have out there. So this is that table down here on the bottom left with the jobs that you get, the 31,000 jobs we have out in the state's economy. And so if you think about that, there might be 4 jobs associated with making products out of final goods. Let's say another 4 jobs in producing them. That gives us our wood product side over here. Right, but we also have to harvest that material and transport that material. So there may be 2 more jobs there, and let's say 3 jobs in forest management and getting that wood out there. Those are the 13 direct jobs. But there's also 11 support jobs. Those are electricians, those are mechanics. That's the job, the money that cycles through the communities and the jobs that it creates. So we're trying to track that as we move through each of these scenarios, or each of the policies that we're looking at, and report it out to the legislature so that they have a better idea of how interacted Idaho's forest economy is. Okay, so now we're going to do a little atlas look around the country. So we have an inventory, a national inventory. The Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Group, there's 150,000 of these points that are forested across the United States out of 300 and some odd thousand total points. So they have a map, a plot about every 6,000 acres across the United States. And we can track those plots over time because they're going to be remeasured. So they're remeasured on about a 5 to 8 year cycle in the east and on a 10-year cycle on the west. So they'll revisit those same points, they'll measure the same trees, and we get an idea of the trends or the changes that go on. But what it also gives us is an estimate of the land base. So this is taking those 150,000 points and just saying who owns them. And so one thing I want you to notice here is that the yellow is the private land, and you can see there's a lot of private land in the east. The green and the purple, that's public lands, and we live in an area that has a heck of a lot of public lands. If you look at the percentages associated with that, right, nationwide, there's 670 million acres of forest out there. 64% of that is private. So looking at this map, it tells you, of course, that most of that private land is in the east and the northern United States. 20% of that total forest land base is public lands, and you know that a lot of that's in the West. So what we can do is dial down from there into just looking at Idaho. And right, here's what we look like. We're like a flip-flop version of the nation. So we have 14% of our 21 million acres of forest that are private versus 64% that's private nationwide, and 76% that's national forest. So we have a very dominant national forest ownership of the lands here in Idaho, and that makes us different than the rest of the United States, or at least the eastern parts of the United States. So, right, that's looking at our original land base. You can also look at it in terms of productivity. So here, the highest sites, the green, are the highest sites of growing timber, down all the way down to red. So that's red is growing less. That's forest land, not timberland. So it's less than 20 cubic feet per acre per year. So those are concentrated there in the Southwest, where we have very dry forests, all the way up to the green. You can look at that just like we did before. If I go with the forward button instead, and you can get a distribution of the forest ownership by the productivity that we have. Right, so you have very few of these forest acres are in those highest 3 site classes, with most of it down 4 and below, and 21% that wouldn't be classified as timberland, it's classified as forest instead. If we zoom in on Idaho here, right, we look a lot like the nation, except we don't have all of that site class 7 stuff that you found down in Arizona, New Mexico, and into Nevada. So we look a lot like that. We have very little of that highest site timber. We are clustered primarily in the site class 5 and 6 throughout the state, and it's up in this northern area. But, right, doesn't mean that we can just ignore the entire state. So this map is from that county yearbook. We have forest processing facilities and jobs throughout the state. So we can't focus on just the highest productivity forest areas. We need to take a holistic look and look across the state when we're looking at forest policy impacts and the jobs and the GDP sources that you get to relate to the impacts. So that's a little, yep.
Sorry to interject. Can I ask, can you define how you are determining between forest land and timberland, the difference there?
So that is a definition that the Forest Service has, and it is the cutoff made at 20 cubic feet per acre per year. So if the land that's forested has 10%, crown class cover, that sort of thing, grows less than 20 cubic feet per acre per year, the Forest Service does not classify it as timberland, they classify it as forest land. So I used to work over in the state of Oregon, and we did a lot of market analyses in Oregon. And if you use those Forest Service timberland classifications, it did not work in Eastern Oregon. There was too much of the land base that was lower productivity forest. And if you were looking at jobs and mills, you couldn't balance timber supply and timber demand without including those low productivity forests. They are growing trees over acreages, and they are being harvested. So that's what it is. It's a definition from our nation's forest inventory. 20 cubic feet per year is cut off. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's super helpful. I just want to make sure that was clear for everyone. And I think we have a quick question that makes sense at this point too.
Okay.
And from Len Oliver, he just asked, if you remove wilderness acres from the federal forest in Idaho, what would the statewide percentage be? Because that likely looks different.
Wait, do that again, sorry, question again?
If you remove the wilderness acres from the federal forest acres in Idaho, what does that look like as a statewide percentage?
Yeah, I don't have that here on me, but we can do that. Obviously, we can query it to have that as well. So yeah, that is classification. And when we are modeling markets that I'll get into later, I actually do withdraw those acres, so they are off limits as far as contributing to products and harvesting and that sort of thing. But we do track them because they are ecologically very important. And when we're looking at these things, it's not always just the jobs and GDP associated with the consumption of goods.
Right.
Sometimes it's non-consumptive uses, recreation and other jobs. And so those acres are very important in that classification. So
great. Thank you. Sorry to interject. Appreciate it.
No worries. So that's our little movement around. But right, this is what the nation looks like in primary processing facilities. And so I put this map up here. So the triangles are going to be the sawmills. Sawmills are good to look at because, of course, they're highest value of wood. And they're also a transition point between logs in and residues out. And there's lots of industries, pulp and paper being one, particle board, MDF, those sorts of things, bioenergy that rely on those residues coming out. But what you'll notice is we are quite sparse with the exception of northern Idaho in terms of primary processing facilities. And when you look into the south and you look into the east, and we'll get into that a little bit later, it is very dense. And so that has a very real impact on the merchantability of materials from forest management, which then has an impact on the costs of managing forests as we go forward. So anyways, it's good to know where all that is. The forest, there's a lot of private forests in the east. There's a lot of mills in the east. They have a lot lower transportation costs in utilizing the woods, which means they have lower forest management costs. So that's something to think about when we're looking at our industry as well. Okay, so let's look at timber harvest in Idaho. So this goes back just to 1990. If you go back farther, of course, there'd be a lot more of the federal, but it is primarily private. So the green here. And then you have this state harvest in the, what do you want to call that, teal before you get into the Navy federal. So the public harvest has gone down quite a bit. This is something, you know, related indirectly, let's say, to the spotted owl and just a change in federal forest management orientation in the 1990s. So if you go and you want to graph that and go back just to 1980, you can see that we were at these higher levels, and we are now at about 15% of what those higher levels were off of federal lands. So there's all sorts of different outcomes related to that. But what we want to look at here is an outcome related to potentially a policy to harvest more. So this could be related to forest partnerships, collaboratives. It could be shared stewardship, good neighbor authority. There's a big push towards getting out there and getting, reducing fuels and perhaps helping forest health. And harvesting is one of the silvicultural tools that we have to do that. So, but it's important to know what that might mean, because once you have an industry established and you change something that's as large as the forest land component is for the federal forests, that has impacts on the private forests and non-industrial forests of our region as well. So we've seen an 85% drop. That's, spotted owl, you saw that across the United States, or at least in the West where we had public forests, the impacts were across the United States. So, and that ripples through, right? That harvest reduction rippled through the economy in the 1990s. There was less harvest, so less logs were coming off of public lands, which means less were going to sawmills, less residues were coming out and going to pulp and paper. Less of that was going into energy and off to final demand. And so we can look at basic economics, and now we're going to go back and do our Econ 101 to try to figure out what that might mean, winners and losers potentially, and then we can maybe flip that around and see if the past can help inform us of what the future might look like, right? All that stuff, it relates directly to jobs, as we looked at before, and taxes in our economy. Okay, so here we are back in Econ 101. You guys are all back in my class. We're going to look at static efficiency. Static efficiency is just the current year. So we have a downward sloping marginal demand or benefit. People are willing to pay less the more and more you get, right? So that's a law of diminishing returns. We have marginal costs that rise. So the more you want to supply into a marketplace, typically the more it costs to supply it. So in a forest setting, this might mean you have to go farther and farther away from the mills or farther and farther away from the roads. And so harvest costs increase, transport costs increase to go up. But when we intersect these two, we get a market clearing price and quantity. That's my P star Q star here, price and quantity. and I can look at what the profits are. So if I look at what people are willing to pay up here and what they had to pay, the difference between is our consumer's net benefit or consumer's profit. So when we're buying things, right, that's a profit or a benefit to us. If we look below that, what we paid for each of these items versus what the cost was of producing them, that's our producer's profit. So these triangles tell us kind of the winners and losers, or the areas that go along with that. And then this area below the marginal cost, if you're just summing up the cost of producing things, is the total cost. So if you're in my class, right, you take your M and N, that's your total revenue, P times Q, right? So that's the profit to the producers plus the costs that they had. If you look at L and M, that's our net social surplus. That's profits to the industry or the sellers and profits to the buyers. So that's this big triangle up here. So if we want to look at how this relates to something like federal forests, we can look at an example where we have, say, private landowners, right? They have an increasing cost of supplying logs. We have public landowners, and here I've got them as a vertical line. So they have a policy that's going to drive what the harvest is, let's say. They're indifferent to the price that's coming out. When you sum those up, you get the supply curve for all landowners into this market. So, right, if we had a policy that was going to reduce public lands supply, so like we saw with the spotted owl or reduction in federal harvest, right, that would have shifted this public supply in, which in turn shifts this total supply in, right? So what's the potential impact of that policy using our Econ 101 example, right? We go back to our graph, we have our consumer's profit, our producer's profit, we've got this reduction in supply that we looked at, and it shifts that total supply up, right? We're gonna now have an intersection between supply and demand that happens here and here, where our Q, quantity of logs, is going to go down and our price of logs is going to go up. And one thing we do know is that consumer surplus, because our preferences didn't change as consumers, went down. So we paid for that as consumers in buying houses, the higher price of lumber, right, carried through to us. The producer surplus, the sellers of those logs, right, that went down perhaps, but we can't tell because it's both the public and the private. But if you look at what did happen when prices went up, that was the best thing that happened to some of the non-industrial private landowners you have in the region was the spotted owl. Prices went through the roof. They did what you'd expect. They harvested when prices doubled, and they made a lot of money when the spotted owl came out. The mills were the losers in that particular one, and us, the consumers, we paid for that. So of course it depends on elasticity. So we won't go over this, but it'll be here. You'll have the presentation. Right? The extent of those changes depends on how steep these curves are. They tend to be quite inelastic or quite steep in log demand within a region. So anyway, that's just that one. I talked about static, right? So that's one period in time we had these profits we were maximizing. That's today, but that decision affects, why is it going forward? Right? That affects the future as well. The next year is affected, the year after that's affected, and the year after that is affected, and those price things are carried on, but we have to then discount them, right? So our producers, consumers, and minus the cost, we're discounting those over time, and that gives us the total effect of this policy going forward. And people look at this and people react to this, right? They don't look at this directly, but it's a model that explains their behavior. And so if I look at the US South, and I look back into up to 1990, roundwood harvest in the US South was rising over time. We reached about the time of the spotted owl and the decrease in federal harvest and the increase in prices here in the Pacific Northwest or the inland Northwest, right? They responded to this decrease in harvest with that, an increase in harvest on their lands. We saw it keep going up quite a bit, and then it came down. That's important as it came down in the future. But what also happened is their inventory increased quite a bit over time. And the reason that the southern inventory increased over time is if you look at over time the forest type distribution, what you'll see is an investment in planted pine. So they responded to those higher acres with reducing what was a decreasing land base now turned to an increasing land base in the US South, and that increase was largely driven by an increase in planted pines. So they planted a lot of acres. Now, if you think about that, that's 20 years ago, right? Those acres are now pretty much on a 25-year rotation in the South. That stuff is all online. So this spotted owl thing, while it seems like a history lesson, it does explain things that happened, but it also explains what's going on now, or helps explain what's going on now. A lot of investment in the South, a lot of timber in the South on those planted pine acres, right? These are millions of acres over on this. This is a lot of land we're talking about in a very productive region that's private land. Okay, the long-term effects of this are still being felt, and we're foresters though, right? We're used to things playing out over long periods of time. And so, right, we're ready to look at something that relates to this behavior shift. Okay, so that's our kind of history lesson. That's us looking back. Now let's look forward. Things that keep me awake at night. One of the first things is federal forest management. I'm in Idaho. It's mostly federal forest. We could look at productive federal forest versus not, as was noted in that question. But we model markets, or we can use these market models, logistics, and economic contribution to evaluate what a change in federal forest management might mean, or the same thing, a reaction to policies or market stimulus. So that means we have to look to the future. And so since we don't know the future, we model the future. We're good at that as foresters. We're good at growth and yield models and harvest scheduling models and land valuation models, right? It's what we do a lot. But we have to do that going on here. So if we asked ourselves, what might an increase in federal harvest mean for Idaho's forest sector? And this could be anything, good neighbor authority, shared stewardship, or forest collaboratives or partnerships that you guys are talking about. But what might it be is that we have this declining harvest, right? We could look at scenarios. So here were 3 different scenarios going up. We've modified these a little bit since what I've showed here. We had a business as usual. So we talked with 23 national forests, and we tried to, or pods, I guess smaller number of pods out here in the West, tried to figure out what their plans were going forward and look at a reasonable and ambitious increase on that harvest. And so I put it back in this graph going to 1980, so you can see that even under the most ambitious, while it is a very big increase in harvest, many times what the current harvest level is, it is still less than what they harvested throughout the 1980s. So just something to think about as we look through. So let's go back though, before we get to our fancy modeling and revisit our Econ 101, right? And we had this, we had private landowners, public landowners, we added them up and we got the total landowners. And let's say we flip it and we want to use the history to inform us about future. And instead, we got these good neighbor authority shit, or maybe there are these new forest plans coming out, and we increase federal harvest. So this is different. We add it again horizontally, and we get an increase from all landowners, right? What's the potential impact of that policy? So if we go back to our basic model with our consumers and producers profit, and now we've shifted our supply curve out with a higher public harvest, right? We get more Q, prices drop, quantities increase. And we can go and look at, right, it's a good thing for us consumers. It's going to lower the price of our housing and that sort of thing, or the lumber that goes into that. But what does it mean to producers? And so here we can go back and take this graph that we just changed with our lowered price, and we can drag those prices over here, and we can look at what it means to the individual landowners. So for private landowners, we can see that their profit was this larger triangle and is now this smaller triangle. So it is basically a profit decrease on the producers. Whereas before, if you remember, when the spotted owl was out there, when you sold timber, I said that was some of the best prices, the best thing that happened to a lot of those non-industrial privates or private landowners. Here it's the opposite. It's kind of we're paying for that past one, if you want to call it that. Right? Versus what happened here on public lands, it's kind of shifted out this way, so it would depend on where those elasticities or where those levels are. So what do we know? We know prices would go down, quantity would go up, and we know that private landowner profit would go down. So that's just from that mark. I said we know it. That's what we would expect looking at our Econ 101. but we need to model it. So what we did is take all those forest plots, those 150,000 points, we took all those mills, so we had 3,300 mills, and we balanced supply and demand annually in that using a model. And we look, so of the 235 million acres of national forest, now we're going to look at just 62 million acres. This was that graph that I showed you with the decreasing harvest. And we're also going to look at changes in harvest expected on Idaho state lands and Montana state lands. And our area of interest is this slash lined out here, right? That's where we're going to increase harvest. And we want to look at national demand, international trade, and all the different forest products out there. Because it's going to matter where you are. Location does matter quite a bit as you're simulating these markets going through time. So we have a paper that we produced on this. It's available in draft form. We're submitting it to a journal here shortly. You can get the results for that, but I'm going to just summarize for you some of the brief ones. What might an increase in federal harvest mean for Idaho's forest sector? Given the market model that we have looking forward, we have forest growth, we have changes in demand going forward, and we've now injected extra timber off of national forests, right? What are the things it could do? It could displace private timber. So in this case, it does displace private timber in Idaho, but 60% of the displacement is actually outside the region. So just like when we saw an increase in harvest, an increase in the southern harvest as a response to the spotted owl, you're going to see the decrease in harvest be affected 60% out of the region as opposed to in the region. So that kind of puts us in a better long run position. Our mills are a little more profitable. We have a reduced, let's say, our transport costs. So, but it is going to displace, 40% of that displacement is in the state. So it is that going forward. Another thing that we had before COVID, I guess, we had a trucking issue where we were talking with the forest industry, and labor was a big issue. And when we displaced this harvest, right, we added harvests, we needed more truckers. And so there was a lot more. And we were tracking routes. So as we're balancing this, we're looking at how many miles trucks would drive and how many loads it would take and how many truckers it would require. And so more harvest from the federal lands in our region, with most of it displacement being 60% of that outside of the region, means we need more truckers. And so there is a labor issue associated with this. So it's a full supply chain situation. You can't just increase federal harvest and not look at the full supply chain. And so that's something to be aware of as we think about these sorts of policies. So the other thing is we can look at jobs. And so I had those scenarios, and so now I've mapped at the county level what GNA, this is the ambitious case, where the jobs were increasing and decreasing for each of the counties. And so I have in this A graph, that's forestry and logging jobs. So they're increased in the green counties, decreased in the red counties. Wood products manufacturing, right? We had areas where they increased and decreased. And then when you combine them, you get this graph down here. So what does it mean? It means that even though I was saying this was maybe a good thing in the long run for us at the state level, right, within our state, there's going to be differences. It's going to depend on the mills that you have, and perhaps more importantly, what the local distribution or the county level distribution of lands are as well. And so if you are largely a private land area, so up here, let's say in far northern Idaho, in this red area where it went down, that is dominated by private lands. And so the benefits were down here where there was more public lands than there were private lands. So this is something to think about at the state level, is that we can't just think that there is one response that Idaho sees, right? There is a response that is varied by county, by mill, by owner, to a change in federal harvest. And so you have to kind of be aware of that going forward. Not everyone's going to be on the bandwagon as you move forward. There's going to be winners and losers that are not consistent across the counties or across the states, even within our local area. It depends on the forest ownership, and it depends on the milling infrastructure that you have. So it's kind of a nutshell look there. The results here demonstrate the complexity of these market responses, even within a single state or single region, as you're looking forward. Okay, so that was my federal harvesting. So now I'm into the rant and rave on other issues that keep me awake at night. China keeps me awake at night, just like it does everyone. So what I have is a graph out here on the left of total global forest products imports. And what I want you to see is somewhere around the recession, our imports went down. We're this kind of reddish orange. China went up. China is now the global leader in forest products imports on a value basis. And if you look over here on forest products exports, Canada was the leader. They used to export primarily to us. This recession correlates with this one over here. And what we see in here is China moving up. I should have used the same colors, but China is moving up to be a large forest products exporter as well. So these global issues are important as we move forward looking here within the United States. And this is another graph that I threw up. This is from Brooks Mendel at Forest, right? Foreign ain't what it used to be. Foreign isn't so foreign either. So this is looking at pulp mill ownership in the US North. So 27% of the capacity in pulp and paper in the US North is owned by Canadian companies as of 2018. So even those foreign things and Chinese issues or whatever it is you're looking at, right, those are now domestic issues as you move forward. So if we look at lumber production, looking in 2017, so Canada is over here on the left. They're a large producer of lumber. United States over here on the right. In our region, here we are down at number 8. We've got Idaho Forest Group just below them, Potlatch, and below that Stimson. We can see these other larger players up ahead. But what I want to point out is when you look at forest processing locations in the United States, and you look at these two graphs, here's West Fraser, largest producer in Canada, third largest producer in the United States. Where are they adding these mills? They're buying mills in the US South. So I've graphed down here where West Fraser has been adding capacity in the US South. I can do the same thing with Canfor, number 2 in Canada, number 6 in the United States. So both of these companies larger than Idaho Forest Group are largest in Idaho. And again, Canfor in the US South, right? Investing in the US South. So think back to our results or impacts of the spotted owl. It led to investment in the US South in terms of planted pine acreage. That stuff is there, it is ready. The US South is a globally important region, and there's a lot of investment from Canadian companies there. Interfor, number 6 in Canada, at number 5 in the United States. That's the only of these 3 big Canadian companies that has some West Side Pacific Northwest investment. So global in what it used to be, the forest sector is changing quite a bit, and a lot of that investment is happening in the US South, and in part as a result of federal policy, federal forest policy of the past. So looking forward to the South, is this going to stop? So again, Brooks Mendel looking at capacity. So this takes us into the reduction of the recession and out, and a big increase in capacity. This isn't just the Canadians investing down there. We have a pellet industry, so the residue industry is very strong in the US South as well. And if you're looking at that, so there's a great summary. I have links in here, and we can make this PowerPoint available to you guys so you can find the primary data. But if you're looking at just the southern, what they're calling the southern softwood lumber explosion, you have Interfor with a $46 million upgrade, Canfor, 275 million board feet investment, right? And you can just click down this list at all of these large mills. These are not the southern mills of before. These are Canadian companies, and in some cases you'll see Klausner in here, German companies investing in the US South and taking everything they learned, say in the interior BC region on mega mill and low cost production, and applying that in the US South. And these are direct competition with our mills in the region as we move forward. Okay, so let's click through that. You guys, again, you'll have, I can make this available so that you can see it. Right, other things that keep me, so this used to keep me awake at night. Low unemployment was what kept me awake. So remember I was talking about log truck drivers or getting people to work in mills. It was because we were at historic low levels of unemployment. And I use this annual energy outlook, comes out every year, and they have projections going forward for different levels of economic growth. And what they had projected, of course, was low unemployment to continue out through 2040, 2050 even. But of course, this is what we've seen recently. But this is just a blip. We're going to get through this. It'll probably come back, and we'll be back to those same labor issues that we had before. And we need to get people interested in working in our supply chain to keep management options available as we go forward. All right, the other thing to look at is housing starts. So what I have here is on this left panel, that's 2017 projections of future housing starts. So you can see not just the annual energy outlook up here on the top, right? We were almost reaching those high levels prior to that recession. But there was variability between things like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, National Association of Home Builders, or Wells Fargo, right? You had a pretty big variation in terms of housing starts going forward. This is a direct relation then to lumber consumption, which is our primary driver of forest products here in the region. By 2018, it was tempered down. And by 2019, it had dropped yet again. So you can see I've shifted the y-axis here down. So I've shifted it down, and they've also come together in that everyone has this very muted projection basis going forward. So again, so that ripples through the economy. That means something to us. But we have this coronavirus. Here's how things have been shifted after that. So we see 2020 as being not so good. 2021 maybe getting back to where we thought we were going to be in 2020, and then they've kind of returned to that longer term projection. So here I've left the 2019 out. We kind of end up in the same place. We're just going to have a bumpy ride getting there. Okay, another thing I like to look at is forest carbon. I don't know if you guys can see this graph, but what I've done is plot out all the different projects. So this is almost a year old when I did this. But I looked at all the different 96 projects for ARB, so that's California's Air Resources Board, cap and trade, the regulatory market there. And there are 4.3 million acres, or at least as of last May, enrolled in these programs. And these QRs. QR is a ton of avoided emissions. There have been 124 million of these QRs produced, or carbon credits or carbon offsets produced on these lands across the United States. So if you consider it's 10 to 15 bucks, closer to 15 bucks per credit, right? Forest carbon, that's $1.2 billion when you take those 124 million credits. 1.2 to getting up to $2 billion in this market just in the last few years for California. Now it's going to change going forward. You have to have more of a direct environmental benefit in California, and then maybe there'll be less of these moving forward. But there's also other states that have looked at adopting some of these protocols that California uses in doing it. So I have here opportunity knocks. It's a good time to get forests involved. There's a great win-win story if we can do it, where you can take lands that are past, let's say, their culmination MAI, and maybe either thin them or harvest them to get them growing faster. And then you can get lands that are being harvested at lower than their culmination MAI rotations and extend those rotations. And we can have both more carbon on the landscape, or more carbon flux, carbon change on the landscape, and more forest products as we move forward. But we have to allow ourselves to be incentivized. And so forest carbon I see as a great opportunity moving forward. Okay, another big one here is mass timber. We've got 2 of these in the region here as startups. So we have Colville, Vaughan has one, and then Catan has one in Spokane, and then the original Smartlam out there in Montana. So our region has been very progressive in adopting mass timber. And this is, of course, an example here at the University of Idaho in our new arena. It's going to be very wood-dominated, wood-forward-focused. This is exciting going forward because this is new demand. This is demand we didn't have before. And last thing I was going to bring up is the importance of economics of Idaho's forests. So 90% of the primary products that we produce in Idaho leave the state before they reach that final stage of production. So mass timber gives us something where we can actually add value perhaps within the state. And I know I was talking Spokane and Colville, and I know they're not in the state. But right, that's keeping value within our region. And I think that's something we need to really be thinking about as well, is how can we not only kind of merchandise our material, but also do it in a way that provides the most benefit to our economies. And so with that, I will leave it to questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Greg. As a reminder, if folks do have questions, send them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And if we aren't able to get to everyone's today, we'll try and follow up with some responses later on in the week. So a couple just to throw out at you first. Tom Schultz asked if you accounted for any changes in consumptions by mills in your analysis.
So yes, there are mills going up and mills going down. So the way that I'm doing it is I am increasing capacity for lumber production in the United States based on the changes that we expect in housing starts and the underlying demand and the profitability of those mills. And so our mills get more profitable. I don't do it right away. I do it over time as that new capacity or as that new demand comes online. Certainly a policy that would assist the mills. So even though we know that they are going to be the net benefit, they're going to benefit from it, I don't see that as a bad thing. I see that as a good thing, in that they are primed to be incentivized as well to add capacity sooner as opposed to later. So the faster we respond to a change in federal harvest, the more of that displacement happens outside of our region, and we have winners on the private side, the selling side, and the buying side of the market. So good question, Tom.
Yeah, that's great. Tim McGuire asked if your economics include work that's being done for hazardous fuels treatments and forest health prescriptions such as forest thinning.
Yeah, so I guess it's in there to the extent that it's in the public harvest, that base public harvest level. We are doing, so in the numbers that I gave, we were allocating the federal harvest based on kind of a least cost methodology. So we were targeting areas where we thought the programs could kind of be the most financially viable. We have a master's student working right now on doing that the opposite way. We have a sub-model here that looks at the probability of fire and the combustion rates that you would get on each of these plots. And instead of targeting the least cost plots, we target then reducing the consumption, fire consumption levels the most, which changes where you would harvest stuff, which then would change. Picture that county map with the counties turning red or green, right? It can flip that around as well. So certainly that is something we're thinking about, but that is not the way I was doing it quite here. I was least cost, trying to get more acres done.
That's interesting. What's the timeline for your master's student work, looking at the reverse?
Yeah, well, timeline was the spring, but we had a bit of a hiccup and things. So we're hoping that will be done this summer. But yeah, everything got thrown into a little bit of a tailspin there.
No, understandable. That sounds great. So looking forward to it. A question we had from Frank Schwartz. He's asking if you looked at the economic contributions of livestock grazing on forest lands, and in addition, kind of their contributions to forest health.
Yeah, no, this timber market model was what I'm doing there. We have a companion to one of those studies I showed you in the beginning that had the direct and indirect for just the forest sector in the state. We are doing that for all natural resources, which would include grazing. And it is actually the grazing that is holding that up for now a couple of years, to try to figure out, disconnect grazing from agriculture and other uses has been harder than we thought. but we do want to get it in there. Again, that doesn't address though your sustainability issue of how that affects perhaps forest health or that sort of thing. But it would get at the jobs associated with that and the grazing's contribution to the economy. It's just, as I said, proven a little more challenging to disconnect than we had hoped.
Right, sounds great. Phil Puff asked, and it was related to a graph that you had shown, but he asked if he saw this graph correctly, how do forest and logging jobs go down in Bonner County if there's an increase in the federal timber supply? He thought that's maybe what he was reading.
Yeah, so it's where that happens and then where it displaces things. And so the model is just allocating those increases in federal harvest at each of those 23 national forests where they're least cost. And so what we can do is we can break the results out into individual mills. But mills that were dominated by private timber tended to see decreases than mills that were dominated or had very little federal timber, but large federal land bases. So it's never kind of an easy story to tell in terms of how things happen, but we can look individual mill at results and try to decipher what happened. But in general, it was, if you were a mill that was going strong on private land and we injected a lot of public timber, other mills that were better positioned to use that timber outcompeted you.
Great. And I think if folks want to keep sending any questions, we might have time for one or two more. The last question I have comes from Carol Creebson, and this was before you got into some of the breakdown of the different wood types in the South, but her question was on harvesting in the East versus the West. She says, they have more hardwoods in the East and Southeast, where the Northwest has more pine. So since hardwood is basically being privately grown, that would increase more production in the East and Southeast, right? It was her question, kind of before we got into the breakout. But I think asking again that we're just going to see more ramping up in the East and Southeast with the private land ownership. Yeah.
It's driven by all sorts of things. There's a pellet export assumption here as well. That actually has been pretty much in line with what they have been exporting. And the pulp mills that they have out there are using that hardwood timber as well. What we were asked to look at in the East were the effects of tariffs on hardwood timber and translating that to those effects on private landowners in the East. So we had tariffs both in China and in Turkey. And we were asked to look at that, but of course everything fell apart shortly after, and those tariffs were kind of moot, at least currently.
No, that's great. Were there other types of products, I guess, that you were looking at? I just remember your stories of kind of the furniture making in Idaho and talking a little bit about that as an example, but is there anything you want to elaborate on with potential for markets in Idaho?
Yeah, I think probably we were talking about with the furniture, and there's the more of that type of secondary processing that we can get, that you have 90% of that leaving the state, and then the value leaves the state essentially. And so more of that we can do in our state or in our region, the better. And so that's why I was saying we were excited about CLT. We'd be excited about other potential uses of timber. One of the things that we have out in our area is that we don't have a big pulp demand. And so we do have pulp mills up in the northern component there, as I said, over into Spokane, and we have particle board and other consumers of that over in Montana. But aside from that, when you get down into that lower part of our state where those are fire-prone forests that are lower productivity, there isn't a lot of merchantability options there. So it's interesting stuff, but anyway, I didn't answer it, did I?
No, that's great. No, it is helpful. I think the point being just that we do have a lot of value leaving the state, and if we can find ways to capture that and keep it here, all the more better. And I think for a lot of economies, but also for jobs and and forest health benefits. So that's all the questions that I have coming through the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question. Or I'll just mention again, this is being recorded. We'll make this available on the IFRP website. We'll also include Greg's slideshow that has some of those links and some of that information available for folks if they want to do a little bit more research. And if there's other questions that come up, please feel free to shoot us an email. I think everyone should have Elizabeth's email, or you can send an email through the IFRP website and we can be following up and responding to questions that way as well. And again, we're looking forward to making more of this content available. We really appreciate Greg taking the time to walk us through all this research and all this time and thought that's been put into this. I think it's super interesting, and I think especially the story of the West versus the East and some of the South, the trends in the South are really compelling. So again, thank you for your time, and thanks to all the IFRP folks who are taking the time to join us. We'll be making some future programming available, and hope this is beneficial for folks. And thanks again to Elizabeth and the LinkedIn group for hosting and making this available for everyone. So I think that's all we have for today. Thanks again, Greg.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.